Okay, we're not going to spend a lot of time on the historical stuff, except to touch on a couple central people and points that'll be sort of name dropped a lot more later. Aside from that, we can just talk about historical bits or classic studies where it ends up being relevant in a given topic further into the course. So, first off, the biggest figure in respondent conditioning is Ivan Pavlov. He was working in Russia in the late 1800s as a physiologist, basically doing medical research. He wasn't a psychologist, rather he was studying reflexes, and he just happened to discover and describe some principles of learning that ended up being super fundamental to psychology later. Specifically, he really formalized the idea of respondent conditioning, or what we sometimes call classical conditioning. That work actually got him a Nobel Prize in the early 1900s. It was the first one Russia ever got. But early on, a lot of his work wasn't really known in the English-speaking world because he was working in Russia and writing in Russian. So the other big historical name in respondent conditioning is John Watson. You may have heard of him as the little Albert guy, and we'll talk about that experiment later. But he extended Pavlov's work and really popularized it in the Western world, and specifically where he was working in America. Now, Watson took this stuff super seriously, and in fact, he thought we'd kind of discovered something so foundational about psychology that it could basically explain most human behavior. In 1916, he was president of the American Psychological Association, and he gave a keynote speech where he really pushed his new philosophy of behaviorism, which he saw as natural science akin to biology and chemistry and physics, which would look at behavior in a purely objective way. For him, that meant sticking to only observable behavior and not talking about subjective inner stuff or mental experiences or what we might later call cognitive constructs. He really pushed for methodological behaviorism, basically a scientific methodology where we get the most understanding of humans by focusing directly on their behaviors and their reactions, the stuff we can objectively observe. One thing to note about Watson is he really downplayed the role of genetics. To him, learning was everything. Nowadays, we don't really take the whole nature-nurture debate very seriously as a binary dichotomy, at least. But he really did see human psychology as super strongly on the nurture side and very little on the nature side. In fact, here's a famous quote from him that often gets cited in all sorts of textbooks. He said, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggar man and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors." So basically he's saying, like, personality variables don't really matter. Stuff you're born with doesn't really matter. It's all about learning. It's all about your environment. It's all about nurture rather than nature. But I have added here the last sentence, which almost always gets left out in textbooks and other places you'll see this quote. He actually goes on to say, "I am going beyond my facts, and I admit it. But so have the advocates of the contrary, and they've been doing it for many thousands of years." So yes, he's a bit extreme relative to the more nuanced approach of a modern behaviorist, but he was at the time really fighting hard to convince people of the importance of experience in shaping our behavior in a way that wasn't necessarily strongly recognized at that time. Now, both of these figures, Ivan Pavlov and John Watson, they were really focused on the SR type of learning that we talked about before, the type of learning driven by stimulus-stimulus associations. In other words, respondent conditioning is what Pavlov and Watson were all about. Around the same time, though, another researcher was coming at things from a pretty different angle. So a guy named Edward Thorndike studied what you might think of as kind of trial and error learning, where the learning comes from success or failure, figuring out what works and what doesn't. In other words, the learning's really driven by consequences of behavior. So let's watch just a little video clip about his work, which, like Pavlov, focused initially and most heavily on animals. In his case, he did some famous work on cats.
But how is a new skill learned? That was a question which began to fascinate Thorndike. To answer it, he built some ingenious puzzle boxes from which cats could only escape by operating latches.
And in you go.
cat appears to be very clever in engineering its escape, solving the problem with a deftly placed paw and a push of its nose. But Thorndike didn't believe that an animal, even a clever cat, understands the consequences of its behavior. When he placed a cat in the puzzle box for the first time, Thorndike was unable to see any evidence of flashes of insight. The successful actions appeared first by chance. He proved that the apparent cleverness arose by trial and error, and used graphs to measure the rate of learning. A well-practiced cat quickly recalls the actions that help it escape to its reward of food. If an action brings a reward, Thorndike believed that that action becomes stamped into the mind. In his thesis, he explained further his ideas about learning, that behavior changes because of its consequences. He called this his law of effect, which explained how even wild creatures develop new habits.
So Thorndike's law of effect was basically formulated like this. Over time, successful impulses are stamped in and non-successful impulses are stamped out. There's some variety or randomness in our behavior, but things that end up working, we do more, and things that don't end up working, we start to do less. Notice that his focus is on an RS relationship, right? That fundamental bit of operant conditioning, rather than on the SR relationship that Pavlov and Watson had focused on. Now, Watson, who was pretty influential, mostly rejected Thorndike's work early on. He thought the law of effect had too many subjective elements to make it scientific enough for his methodological behaviorism. But other people were reading Thorndike's work and realized he was onto something pretty crucial here. So the most famous person by far who built off of Thorndike's work was B.F. Skinner. Someone who, about as well known in psychology as Freud. Skinner made explicit and systematized this distinction between Pavlov's type of learning, what Skinner called respondent conditioning, and Thorndike's trial and error kind of learning, which Skinner called operant conditioning. So you can blame Skinner for that terminology of respondent versus operant. Now, Skinner took Thorndike's law of effect and he restated it with a lot more precision as his famous principle of reinforcement. So the principle of reinforcement that Skinner came up with states that all operants, all operant behavior, in other words, the responses that we can emit, the behaviors we can emit, all operants are followed by consequences that either increase or decrease the probability of that response in the same context in the future. Which is a mouthful, but he's literally just saying what we talked about in the previous video for operant conditioning. The discriminative stimulus, SD, is the context he's referring to at the end here. And the R in our notation is the operant he mentions at the beginning, the behavior we're focusing on. Well, the stimulus S in our notation is the consequence that the behavior produces, the thing that happens after you do the behavior each time. The part that makes this learning, that makes it a process, is that this RS thing happens over and over and over in that context. That we're talking about incremental adjustments in future probabilities of behavior based on past experience. And nothing here in Skinner's definition is problematic in the way that Watson complained about Thorndike's formulation. Here we're just talking about the probability of behaviors showing up based on the stimuli, the context. There's no mental constructs here. There's nothing about stamping things into the mind. And so Watson and others could more easily accept this as a sort of fitting within methodological behaviorism as well. Now, here's one key thing you'll want to remember about Skinner. He was not quite as extreme as Watson in a lot of ways. Watson basically ignored genetic influences, as we talked about. But unlike Watson, Skinner didn't deny the role of genetics. He emphasized that behavior is an interaction of genetic and environmental influences, which is, of course, the modern understanding of those things, right? Natural selection has given us the genetic predispositions we're born with, which includes a nervous system that can adapt and learn and change based on the environment we're exposed to and the experiences we have. So Skinner recognized that. Also, another big difference between Skinner and Watson, Skinner doesn't deny inner mental life. He thinks that stuff is still valuable to study in psychology. Sometimes he gets built up as this straw man in pop culture or even in intro psychology courses, but Skinner didn't actually deny that cognitive, subjective things like thinking and feeling and remembering exist. He acknowledges those things. His insight was just to classify those things as themselves being a type of inner or covert behavior. In other words, as something to be explained, not as freestanding causes of behavior. In other words, he put the emphasis on the ing at the end of thinking and feeling. These are active processes, things we do or perform internally, and they can be explained by our past history of reinforcement, operant conditioning, and such. Okay, I said I wanted to keep the history stuff brief, so that's plenty for now. Next up, we're going to pivot to the last two introductory videos of this course that'll be more about methodology, about how people in the experimental analysis of behavior do their research and answer psychological questions.